This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. This week we have episode 388 entitled, How Scribes Corrupted Ignatius' Letter to the Romans. So for the past 3 weeks, we have been looking very closely at the letters of Ignatius, who is an early 2nd century bishop and martyr. He was the bishop of the church in Antioch, a very significant location in early Christianity. And we've been noticing how the letters of Ignatius were tampered with by dishonest scribes long after Ignatius was martyred. The typical date that is assigned to the martyrdom of Ignatius is about the year 110, so at the end of the first decade of the 2nd century. 3 weeks ago, we looked at the authentic 3 letters that survive only in the short Syriac recension. And those authentic letters that Bishop Ignatius wrote were the letter to Polycarp, the letter to the Romans, and the letter to the Ephesians. And we found, when looking at the authentic letters of Ignatius, a relatively unremarkable Christology, but it was clearly not Trinitarian in its understanding of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So the authentic Bishop Ignatius was not a Trinitarian, despite what the internet apologist would have you believe. And over the past few weeks, we have shown how Ignatius' letters to the Ephesians and to Polycarp were tampered with, they were added to, and they were made to say things about the role of the bishop and about Christology that were far more elevated and far more developed than what the authentic Ignatius, or really anybody at that particular time, was actually saying or believing. So in this week's episode, we will examine the final authentic letter of Ignatius, namely Ignatius' letter to the Romans. Our goal is to discern if it was corrupted by later scribes, and if so, how much, and what doctrines were added to Ignatius' authentic testimony. Did dishonest scribes alter and add to Ignatius' letter to the Romans? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is looking at the key expansions of Ignatius' authentic letter to the Romans. So to answer everyone's burning question, yes, the later scribes did add a significant portion to the authentic letter to the Romans. How much did they add to it? Well, we have to kind of get an idea of how big the authentic letter to the Romans is. And again, if you want a copy of this, you can look up William Curitin's version, where he has the Syriac translation there for anyone to see. I have a link to it in the description of this video. And the authentic letter is roughly the size of the New Testament epistle of Jude. But the middle recension, the recension that has actually taken the authentic letter and actually added to it, the middle recension is roughly 50% longer than what the original letter to the Romans actually consisted of. And the additional parts, this additional 50% that was added to it, added entire verses and actually entire chapters. And they would also take some of the original sentences and verses and they would add to them. They would add to the beginning of the passage and also add to the end of the passage. So if you have a copy of the middle recension, these are the texts that were added to the authentic letter to the Romans that the authentic historical Ignatius actually wrote. It starts off with the epistolary greetings, and most of the epistolary greetings were added. Parts of chapter 2, verse 1 were added. Part of chapter 2, verse 2 was added. Part of chapter 3, verse 1 was added. Part of chapter 3, verse 3 was added. Most, and I mean most, like nearly all of chapter 6, like everything except for a single sentence. Chapter 7, verse 1, completely added. Part of chapter 7, verse 2 was added. Part of chapter 7, verse 3 was added. The entirety of chapter 8 was added. In chapter 9, verses 1 and verse 2 were added. And all of chapter 10, which really consists of these farewell greetings, was actually scrapped and it was replaced with a different set of farewell greetings. So you can see there's been a lot of tampering with. Again, this is not just adding a couple of words or a couple of words being mistranslated or there being some holes in the manuscripts and we're not actually sure what's actually there. We have lots and lots of new material here. Again, 50% longer than the original text. I thought, let's find 4 of the most theologically relevant editions, and here they actually are. So the first one, of course, is going to come from the salutations or the greetings. We call this the epistolary greetings. And so I'm going to put up here the text, and in normal font, you're going to see what was actually authentic to Ignatius' letter to the Romans. And then in brackets, this is the part that was actually added to it by later scribes. You can get a sense of what was original and what was actually added. And all you have to do is just compare the original version that survives in the Short Syriac and compare it to the Greek text that we actually have of the Middle Recension. And the Greek text is widely available if anyone wants to purchase it in the Loeb Classical Library. So here's the opening greetings. Ignatius, also called Theophorus, to her who has found mercy in the majesty of the Most High Father and his only Son, Jesus Christ, to the church, beloved and enlightened by the will of him who willed all things that are in faith and love towards Jesus Christ our God. That is Ignatius' letter to the Romans. That's the greetings, the salutations, and that's how it appears in the Middle Recension. So again, the parts that are in brackets have been added to this text, and they are not original to the authentic letter to the Romans. And so what is actually added here? We have this additional reference, not just one, but actually 2 references to Jesus Christ, and the second of which describes Jesus Christ as Jesus Christ our God. Now, last week, we had some references to Jesus Christ our God, or our God Jesus Christ, and I noticed that in a couple of those, it would be God, it would be theos, without the definite article. And so I suggested that the best translation last week, when we were looking at Ignatius' letter to the Ephesians, the scribes were adding these texts, and they were saying that Jesus Christ is a God. That's very different here because the scribe, and I'm not going to assume that this is the same scribe that had corrupted the letter to the Ephesians, this is a different scribe. He is going to describe Jesus Christ as our God, and he's going to use the definite article every single time. So here, you can look in the Greek text of the Middle Recension. Again, you have access to it here. You have this translation, and it says, for Jesus Christ our God, Jesu Christou tou theou imon. Jesus Christ, the God of us. Jesus Christ, our God. So it's Jesus Christ, not a God. He is the God. That is a very significant addition that wasn't original to this text. Why would someone go to all the effort to add in this reference to Jesus Christ and call him the God of us? That's an interesting question. Let's move to our second corruption. This is going to be from chapter 3, verse 3. And again, I'm going to show you in normal font the original reading, and then in brackets, these are the parts that were added to it that appear in the Middle Recension. So in chapter 3, verse 3, it says, nothing that appears is good. For our God, Jesus Christ, rather appears by being in the Father. The deed is not a matter of persuasive rhetoric, but Christianity is characterized by greatness when it is hated by the world. That's Ignatius' letter to the Romans, chapter 3, verse 3, as it appears in the Middle Recension. So notice here what was actually added to it. We have this line where it says, for our God, Jesus Christ, rather appears by being in the Father. And then the passage goes on. So again, the Greek of this phrase, our God, Jesus Christ, is ogartheos imon Jesus Christos. We have the definite article. It is the God of us. Jesus Christ is the God of us. A very strong statement of the elevated Christology of the scribes that have tampered with Ignatius' letter. So Ignatius doesn't call him in this passage, our God, Jesus Christ. The later scribes came along and added that into it. But you'll notice in this passage, if you read it carefully, the insertion is really apparent because it disrupts the argument that Ignatius is saying. So let me read to you what Ignatius was saying without the insertion. He says, "Nothing that appears is good. The deed is not a matter of persuasive rhetoric, but Christianity is characterized by greatness when it is hated by the world." So he's talking about doing good deeds, but it has nothing to do with Christology. The insertion is like, let me tell you something about Jesus being our God and how he's actually in the Father, but it has nothing to do with the argument that he's actually making. It's rather apparent that this was a later insertion. Now, some people are going to come back and they're going to say, well, I think that the middle recension is original and that the short Syriac version is actually the corruption. It was the change. But why would you remove this reference to our God, Jesus Christ? Why would you do that? Why would you take that away? It's clear here that it was added because it disrupts the argument that's actually there. I think any person that's willing to look at the evidence is willing to come to that conclusion. So the insertion clearly disrupts the flow of Ignatius' argument. That's our second passage that we're going to look at. The third one we're going to look at is in chapter 6, verse 3. And in this particular passage, if you'll recall from my earlier list, all of this has been added. None of this is original to Ignatius' letter to the Romans. All of this has been added. So, of course, all of this, as you're going to see, is in brackets. This is what the scribes added to the text, this line. "Allow me to be an imitator of the suffering of my God. If anyone has him within himself, let him understand what I want, and let him sympathize with me, knowing what constrains me." That's Ignatius' letter to the Romans, chapter 6, verse 3, and this only appears in the middle recension. Nothing here can be found in the short Syriac recension. And again, you'll notice here the reference to my God, but it's the God who has suffered. And so in Greek, you have tu pathos, tu theou mu, the sufferings of the God of me. So we have God here actually suffering. I think this is not a reference to the Father suffering. I think this is just another reference to Jesus Christ being called the God, tu theou mu, my God. And he's describing the fact that he is able to suffer. He is quite passible in this passage. So that's three passages that have been tampered with the addition of the declaration that Jesus is my God or the God, and that is a very significant and noteworthy addition by these later scribes. I don't think that this is an accident. And the fourth and final insertion that we're going to look at is in chapter 9, verse 1. So, as we saw in our earlier list, chapter 9, verse 1 has been completely added. This passage is nowhere to be found in the authentic original letter of Ignatius to the Romans. So, of course, all of this is going to be in brackets. So, how did the scribes corrupt this passage? Let's read on and find out. "Remember in your prayer the church in Syria, which has God instead of me for its shepherd. Jesus Christ alone will oversee it, and so will your love." That's Ignatius' letter to the Romans, chapter 9, verse 1, only in the middle recension. Again, this passage does not appear in the original letter that Ignatius wrote. All of this has been added. All of this has been corrupted and inserted into the text. And notice here, he's saying that, okay, I as the bishop, I've left. But who's going to be the person that's going to be the overseer? Who's going to be the one that is overseeing the church in Syria? Remember, he is the bishop of Syria, the bishop of Antioch. Antioch, of course, is located in Syria. You all knew that. But he's saying here that it's going to be God instead of me. God is the one that's going to be the shepherd. God is going to be the bishop. And who is God? In the next line, he says, Jesus Christ alone will oversee it, namely oversee the church. The it there is feminine. That matches the grammatical gender of church. Ecclesia is grammatically feminine. And here, Jesus Christ seems to be called God with the definite article. In Greek, we have to theo. Both of those are dative singular. So we have four passages in which the corrupting scribes have added this later exalted Christology, and they're not just describing Jesus as divine or that he is super important or that he's highly exalted. They're calling him God, and they're using the definite article in every single occurrence. He's not just a God, he is the God, at least this particular scribe who has altered and changed the authentic letter to the Romans. What are some observations that we can have? We just kind of take a step back and look at the Christology of Ignatius, but also the Christology of the scribes that came after, because it's pretty easy to see. You take the two lists of verses and you see what it is matching and what actually has been added. And so we can discern what Ignatius originally believed and what these later scribes believed. This is going to move us to our second point number 2, which is just observations. So one of the things that stands out to me is that it's quite clear that neither the historical Ignatius nor the scribes that came in after and altered his theology and added all these high Christology passages, neither of them were Trinitarians. Not even close. The middle recension is not Trinitarian in its theology. How do we know this? Because they never defined the one true God as 3 co-equal, co-eternal divine persons. They never say that there's one God consisting of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They don't do that. They never define God with the number 3. They don't say that God is multiple persons. They don't do that. They don't even discuss the divinity of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is rather undeveloped. And what we can see in the authentic Ignatius is that the Father is repeatedly called the Most High. And if he is the Most High, that means he is the highest person. He's at the Most High position. And this indicates, of course, a belief that the Father is greater than the Son. And this is not the Son emptying himself and subordinating himself to the Father. No, the Father is just called the Most High. That's his title. And of course, that's the title from the biblical scriptures that we actually have of the Father, of the Most High God. So there is subordination in the belief of Ignatius. Now we see that these later scribes have come and they have called Jesus God, and not just Theos. We have the definite article, the God. He is the God. I think that the authentic Ignatius, not the one that is being depicted by these later scribes, the authentic Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch that was serving in a church, and he was martyred in the first decade of the 2nd century, he probably had a 2-stage logos theory, high Christology. He probably had that. That's probably the best way to kind of explain. It's difficult because we don't have enough of his writings to get a sense of it, and so many of his texts could be read in multiple ways. And so we would like to have more information in order to be firm in our conclusions, but it's quite clear he's not a Trinitarian. He believes in subordination. He believes that the true God is the Father alone, but he has some pretty exalted things to say about Jesus. So he's probably a 2-stage logos theorist with a high view of Christology. But that high view is not that Jesus, the Son, is co-equal with the Father. Now, it's very possible also, and I want to make sure that we're clear on this, that these scribes that are describing Jesus as God, as the God, they could be referring to Jesus as God in the Greco-Roman sense, in the sense that the Greco-Roman world would call all of their heroes as gods. They would deify their heroes and their great leaders and their rulers, like the Roman emperors. When they died and they were exalted to the afterlife, they were deified and they were called God. So it's very likely that the scribe has been influenced by this, and that he is describing Jesus as God in the sense of the Greco-Roman world, in which they would describe their exalted heroes as gods. I think that's a possibility that we need to leave on the table. I think it's an important thing that is worth considering, because it's quite clear that they are not describing Jesus as God in the same way that the Father is described as God. So, the authentic Ignatius believed that the true God was the Father alone. Of course, he had a high Christology, but it was a subordinationist Christology, and he has a pretty unsophisticated view of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit for Ignatius is certainly not important enough to even discuss or write about or clarify in his writings. We can say for sure is that the authentic Bishop Ignatius was not, in any manner, Not even close. He's not a Trinitarian. He's not a proto-Trinitarian. He never once says that the one God consists of three co-equal, co-eternal, divine persons. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Join us next week as we engage some recent arguments and interpretations of Colossians chapter 1, verse 16. What is Paul describing in this Christological passage, and how can Paul's wisdom Christology help illuminate our understanding of this disputed passage? Please look forward to our next episode. Now, if you enjoy our podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths of the oneness and unity of God and of the humanity of Jesus. You can support the podcast absolutely for free by subscribing, by clicking that like button and clicking the share button right now so that you can pass this on to other interested persons. If you'd like to throw us a few dollars, you could check out the episode subscription for a link to PayPal, or you can subscribe on the YouTube channel with one of two monthly membership options. My name is Dustin Smith. Until next time, please take care.